Thank you so much, Evan, and thank you all for joining us here. I was reflecting on my way over as I walked past the Old South Meeting House and down Congress Street, where the folks who destroyed the tea walked 250 years ago this December, about the nature of that history. And then, of course, thinking about my own history here in the city. And I moved to Boston in 1984 and got a job in a little restaurant that was right over there, and we would look out at the ships here. And I remember one afternoon, one of my fellow cooks asked, "Does anyone know anything about the Boston Tea Party?" And half an hour or so later, when I finished telling him the story, he was looking at me kind of dazed and said, "You probably are working in the wrong place." And I stayed there long enough, actually, to 38 years and 6 months ago tonight, have a date with a young woman who worked in that same restaurant. And here we are. Thank you. Someone who's put up with many of those half-hour answers to questions that you weren't really that curious about. So it would be really presumptuous of me to tell here the story of the Boston Tea Party, because this museum does a terrific job of getting people engaged in the story and understanding the story and feeling a part of the story. So what I'm going to do is talk about why this became such a big event in Massachusetts history. It was, of course, the year 1773, and Governor Thomas Hutchinson began the year by calling the assembly into session over in Cambridge. In Cambridge, because Cambridge would be less susceptible to the whims of the Boston mob. And governors, royal governors, have been trying for years to get the assembly to move out of Boston, where it would be too heavily influenced by people like Samuel Adams or the other Boston radicals. And Governor Hutchinson had some good things to report when the assembly opened. One was that he had resolved a long-standing dispute with New York, setting the western border of Massachusetts, something that has brought us 250 years of good relationships with our neighbor to the west, the Empire State. Also, when the assembly opened, they received a petition from some enslaved folks in Massachusetts wanting the assembly to recognize their plight. And this was actually something that would continue in the coming years as the assembly came into greater conflict with the governor and made a stand for human liberty. In 1774, they said, "We expect great things from men who have made such a commitment to the rights of man," reminding the assembly about their plight here in Massachusetts. But the real reason Governor Hutchinson called the assembly into session wasn't to talk about New York or to hear pleas from African Americans. It was because he wanted to squelch a movement that was spreading through the province. In the fall of 1772, Boston called a town meeting to address one of the most serious problems that the Boston leaders saw emerging. I know we can have a great reenactment of the destruction of the tea, and there have been reenactments of other of the signal events leading to the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre, and so on. I keep thinking how we could reenact this particular issue that motivated people in the fall of 1772 to go to a town meeting in Boston and draw up a blistering report about this egregious piece of British policy. The issue was, who will pay the judges in Massachusetts? Back in 1770, as you're probably aware, the group of British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston and killed 5 Bostonians in an episode almost immediately Bostonians called the Horrid Massacre, and the soldiers were put on trial for murder. Thanks to the able defense of John Adams and Josiah Quincy, all of the soldiers were acquitted, except for 2 who were found guilty of manslaughter, and the penalty would have been hanging, but John Adams pleaded benefit of clergy, so those 2 guilty soldiers were branded on the thumbs and then sent to New Jersey, which is probably more punishment than anyone really deserved. Parliament knew they had dodged something, a really serious problem. What happens the next time Crown officials get into trouble in one of these colonies and they don't have a John Adams or Josiah Quincy to defend them? Parliament wanted to start paying the judges in Massachusetts. And that issue, the paying of judges, caused throughout the province angry citizens to go to the courthouses and demand that the judges refuse the salary. And every judge did except one. And that judge was Peter Oliver, who was the Chief Justice of the Superior Court. And Judge Oliver said he actually was an iron manufacturer by trade. Being a judge took a lot of time away from his business. It wasn't that exciting or lucrative an occupation. He was doing a public duty by being a judge. And if Parliament wanted to give him another £200 a year, that didn't cover what he lost by being a judge. He refused to renounce the salary. So what do you do with a judge like this? The Assembly insisted. The Massachusetts Charter says we pay the judges, and this painting of Samuel Adams was done at that time. Well, we'll come to the painting of Samuel Adams in a moment. He's pointing at the Massachusetts Charter, and his hand is holding the instructions of the town of Boston, and it's resting on the minute book of the town of Boston. The Charter says we pay the judges. A judge who is accepting a salary from someone else is violating the Charter, and he should renounce it, but Oliver refused. Question is, what can we do? John Adams suggested impeaching Judge Oliver. The other members of the Assembly said that won't work because then it would be the Governor's Council, which hears the case, and presiding over the Governor's Council is Governor Hutchinson, who not only agrees with Judge Oliver, he's his brother-in-law. And the judge and the council would simply say, you can't impeach a judge. John Adams said, we still have to do it. And they did. And predictably, the Governor's Council, led by Governor Hutchinson, said the Assembly can't impeach judges. So here we are. What do we do when a judge is refusing to follow his oath and when we feel Parliament is changing the rules about how we are governed? It always had been the towns of Massachusetts that determined who would be their sheriffs, their magistrates. The governor would choose judges who came from here, and they were answerable to us and not to someone else. And that's why in the fall of 1772, Boston calls a town meeting presided over by James Otis. And Otis, Samuel Adams, and Josiah Quincy write a report about how these acts of Parliament are violating our rights as men, as British subjects, and as Christians. And they sent this report to the other towns of Massachusetts, asking the other towns to form committees of like-minded citizens who could correspond with them and with each other. So a call goes out to form committees of correspondence around Massachusetts to correspond with one another about this egregious assault on their liberties. And the towns respond even more forcefully than Boston had. Some of the towns go much further than Boston had in protesting what the British government, what Governor Hutchinson and Judge Oliver were doing. And Revolution 250 has pulled some of the wonderful quotes from the towns. We actually put them on refrigerator magnets because the towns of Massachusetts are pushing this further even than Boston was. In the minds of Hutchinson and Oliver, the real problem was isolated in Boston. This shows the problem, if indeed it is a problem that people want to govern themselves, was one that people in Worcester felt, Falmouth, Newton, Chelsea, all agreed on standing with the Assembly, standing against Parliament. And Hutchinson calls the Assembly into session to set this whole record straight, to tell the towns and to tell their representatives in the general court that they really didn't govern Massachusetts. Parliament did. Now, Governor Hutchinson opens the Assembly with a 2-day speech explaining the place of the Massachusetts Assembly in the governance of Massachusetts and of the empire. I often think that in another lifetime, Hutchinson probably would have been a college professor. He's writing a very long history of Massachusetts. And one thing college professors like to do, as you're probably aware by now, is give very long lectures. And we also like it if you write down what we say. And at the end of the semester, we know how smart you are if you agree with what we have just said. And if for some reason there's a disagreement, we speak more slowly and use smaller words when we repeat what we have tried to explain to you. This is good for a college professor sometimes, not good for a politician. And Hutchinson explains to them that Parliament governs in the British Empire. And the Assembly has to recognize this, has to accept this, and has to submit to the will of Parliament. And if they won't, their only recourse is to declare their independence of Parliament. And he is sure that's not what they wanted, because they could not remain independent for long. They quickly would become subsumed by another empire, the Dutch, or the French, or the Spanish, an empire less sensitive and less embracing of the rights of man than the British Empire, and they would lament ever having left it. Hutchinson thought when word gets back to London how he has set these yokels straight, people would be happy. People aren't, because so far no one talking about the rights of the colonists had mentioned independence as their end wish. They had talked about self-government. They talked about remaining under the crown. Our assemblies govern us, not the Parliament. But now Hutchinson is not only telling them independence is your only option other than submission, he's offering it to them. They know, the members of the Assembly know they cannot submit to the will of someone else. They were sent to represent Newton or Dorchester or Roxbury or Falmouth, not to rubber stamp things that a distant body over which they had no control set before them. So Hutchinson's speech is one of the great political blunders leading to what we know, or what seems to be an inexorable path toward independence. And it's something that Samuel Adams knew how to exploit. But the other big event that happens in 1773 that sets us on this path is one that I know none of you would have anticipated, and that's the death of Thomas Whately. You know about Thomas Whately's death. Thomas Whately was a British official. He had been secretary to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Grenville. George Grenville was the British minister responsible for the stamp tax, the Townshend duties, and other pieces of legislation that had embroiled the colonies in protests and disputes in the 1760s. And when Bostonians protested violently, the Stamp Act in 1765, going so far actually as to tear down Andrew Oliver's warehouse on Long Wharf, a two-story brick building where they thought the stamps were being held, tearing it down with with crowbars and axes and their bare hands and throwing it into the harbor. The stamps weren't inside. And then they invited Mr. Oliver to come to their gathering place, which they began to call the Liberty Tree, where he saw an effigy of himself hanging with a noose around its neck, holding a sign saying "Death to the Stamp Tax." And they asked him if he wanted to resign his commission as a tax agent. And he said, yes, he did. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson thought he had made a mistake by giving in to the mob. Word goes around town that not only was Thomas Hutchinson a supporter of the stamp tax, it was his idea. And one night in August, about a week and a half after the destruction of Oliver's warehouse, Hutchinson and his daughter are having dinner in the North End when they hear the mob approaching. Hutchinson's not afraid of a mob, but then they hear an axe hitting the front door and the windows smashing. And the mob comes in, Hutchinson flees. Things really get going when they find his wine cellar. They cut the eyes out of his portrait. And they take the third volume of his History of Massachusetts, along with all the documents he had collected to write it, and they throw the pages out into the street and trample them. One of Hutchinson's friends said later that apparently no one wanted to read another volume of the wretched history. This is what his friends are saying about him. You can imagine what those who didn't like Hutchinson were saying about him. But our friend Whately is really curious. Why are the Americans so upset with what we think is a perfectly reasonable piece of legislation? So he writes to Thomas Hutchinson saying, why are the Americans protesting so much? For Hutchinson, this is exactly what you want to happen. A person in a position of power in England wants to know what I think. So Hutchinson writes to Whately, really unburdening himself, but also making it clear he disagrees with these people protesting. He understands that Parliament is the governing force, but they are wrong, they are misguided, and also gives him an opportunity to talk about other folks in political life in Boston without them knowing what he is saying, and he has the ear of an important British official. Whately, as I said, dies in 1773. The executor of his will comes across all of these letters he had received from Thomas Hutchinson, and the executor knows that there's some trouble with the Massachusetts Assembly, because the Assembly, having had this long lecture from Hutchinson, had asked their agent in London, Benjamin Franklin, to get Hutchinson removed as governor, something they had done back in 1769 when they disagreed with another governor. Write to London, the Privy Council will have a hearing and we'll send someone over whom we can get along with. Benjamin Franklin is the agent of the Assembly. He is given all of these letters that Hutchinson had written about the Assembly, and Franklin sends them off to the Massachusetts Assembly, saying these are private letters. Under no circumstances can they be made public. They're simply for your edification. Now, Samuel Adams, who is really the leader of the Massachusetts Assembly, knows what to do with secret letters that you cannot publish. He has the doors of the Assembly chamber locked, and the clerk reads them aloud to the shocked members of the Massachusetts Assembly who hear what their governor, who is native-born guy from Massachusetts, graduate of Boston Latin and of Harvard, his family has been here since the 1630s, what he is saying to people in positions of power in England. Things he would not have said. He might have said this privately to people in the Assembly, but here he has an opportunity to tell people in London about these Lilliputian assemblies. We all know what Lilliputians are. They're the little tiny characters in Gulliver's Travels. It's ridiculous. Well, we don't need to talk more about the Lilliputians. And in 1772, if you're a Rhode Islander, you know Rhode Islanders burned a British revenue cutter on Narragansett Bay. Here Hutchinson is saying, next time this happens, bring a few over to London. The sight of a few of them being tried at executioner's dock will calm things down. He also says that you cannot move 3,000 miles away from England and expect to enjoy all the rights of Englishmen. And he says that maybe you should crush these people a little bit, and then they'll appreciate what they really enjoy, the liberties they enjoy as members of the British Empire. This pretty much ruins Hutchinson in the eyes of the Assembly. And after about 2 weeks of members of the Assembly going out and sharing this news with others, Samuel Adams announces he's found another set of the letters. It doesn't have the same strictures of secrecy, so we can publish them. This is probably the best-selling document the Massachusetts Assembly ever produced, the letters of Thomas Hutchinson, in which he is not only talking behind the backs of his colleagues in Massachusetts government, he is betraying them to people in positions of power. And now the Assembly demands his recall, and Hutchinson actually asks permission to go to England to plead his case. So this is the end of Thomas Hutchinson's effectiveness as governor. And this, of course, is the big news consuming us here in Massachusetts. But of course, things that are big news here in Massachusetts don't always resonate in other places. I should also point out that in July at Harvard's commencement, the disputation topic was on the legality of enslaving Africans. Every year, the Harvard graduates would choose a topic to dispute in Latin. This is part of the graduation exercises. And this is a potent topic at this time, as the year began with African Americans in Massachusetts asking about their rights. And here are Harvard students talking about the legality of this issue. This is the news in Massachusetts, which doesn't really transcend much the borders of Massachusetts, difficult as it may be for us to imagine a world that isn't watching us and wondering what our next step will be. Because the real issue consuming people in London was India. And in fact, if we were anywhere in the British Empire or anywhere in London thinking about the empire in the 1770s, our thoughts would not be on Massachusetts or even on Pennsylvania or Virginia. We would be thinking first about Barbados and Jamaica, the sugar-producing colonies in the West Indies, and India. And by the early 1770s, the British East India Company, which had been formed in the 1690s to trade with India, had completed the conquest or agreements to govern large portions of the Indian subcontinent. A tremendous story for the East India Company doing this. And if you think about the whole course of colonization, you know, it was Europeans' desire to get the wealth of the Indies, to get the wonderful spices, jewels, silks from India and China that had set that in motion back in the 1400s and 1500s. And now in the 1770s, the East India Company, on behalf of the British Empire, had taken over much of India. Taking over much of India, even though it was a lucrative, valuable thing for the British, not such a great thing necessarily for the people of India, was also a very expensive thing. And the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, having done this. And the company is the largest corporation in the world. And it had just achieved something unbelievable, something that would bring unbelievable wealth to the empire. And now it teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The company goes to the Prime Minister, Frederick Lord North, and asks for a bailout. Lord North sees an opportunity. He will, or Parliament will, loan the company 15 million pounds to help it get over this temporary shortfall in its exchequer. But in return, he will appoint the board of directors of the company. So it's not a takeover, but it is something that gives Lord North and the ministry a degree of control of the company, a degree of influence in the company, as well as a share of the anticipated profits of the company. And as another way of helping the company over this rough patch, Parliament will give the company a monopoly on all tea sold in British North America. There were merchants selling tea here in the North American colonies. In fact, the biggest tea merchant in Boston was Richard Clark, and the Clark family, their son, had gone to London to buy tea, discovers in May that Parliament's passing the Tea Act. The only way we can get tea to sell is by becoming agents of the company. So the Clarks signed on to become agents of the company. Some other merchants in Boston were designated as tea agents, including Thomas Hutchinson's two sons, Thomas Jr. and Elisha. And there were agents appointed in Philadelphia, New York, and Charlestown, South Carolina. And so the tea is going to be sent in September. If Americans want tea, they can only get it through the company. Even though it is a Boston story, we really have to go to Philadelphia for the first response to this. The Philadelphia merchants are certain that the rapacious Yankee traders in Boston will sell out anyone to make a profit. They're certain Boston will allow the tea to land. So the Philadelphia merchant sends a circular letter to the merchants in the other colonies saying, we cannot allow the East India tea to be landed in any port. And Boston convenes a town meeting, and the merchants are pressured to agree to this. Those who had agreed to accept the tea are pressured unsuccessfully to resign their commissions. And over the next 2.5 months, there is pressure put on merchants, there's political agitation, all of this before any of the tea has reached any of the ports. In Philadelphia, John Dickinson, who is one of the best known American political writers back in the late 1760s, he had written a series of essays called the Farmers' Letters, protesting British trade policies, writing this as under the guise of a Pennsylvania farmer. He actually was a Philadelphia lawyer, and he knew that being a Pennsylvania farmer sounds a lot more appealing and disinterested and neutral than if it were the letters of a Philadelphia lawyer. In this essay, he points to the fact that Bengal, which was one of the most fruitful places in the world, had over the first years of the 1770s been experiencing a horrific famine brought on by the company's policies in governing this and in telling the people of Bengal what they could and could not produce, because the company's real interest was in producing things for the company to export. Bengal was experiencing a famine under the company's ministrations. If we allowed the tea to land, we weren't going to be governed merely by Parliament, we would be governed by the East India Company, largest corporation in the world. And it's to avert this that Dickinson and others are saying we cannot allow the tea to land. As I said, the ships leave London in September of 1773, making their way across the Atlantic. One big ship carrying about 900 chests of tea is going to South Carolina. Another carrying 900 chests, each chest weighs about 200 pounds, is on its way to Philadelphia. Another is on its way to New York. And 4 smaller ships, each carrying between 150 and 200 chests, are on their way to Boston. And it's really just by chance that the first of the ships reaches Boston, the Dartmouth, the replica of which you can see outside the window. So the Dartmouth reaches Boston, the town meeting assembles and decides we will put guards on the ship to make sure none of the tea is landed. And in fact, instead of being anchored out in the harbor, the ship is brought to Griffin's Wharf, where it can be under the guard. 50 men working in 12-hour shifts of 25 men each to make sure the tea doesn't get unloaded. And then 2 other ships arrive. And it's a curious piece of British law. There's a clock that starts ticking when the ships arrive. A ship can remain in port for up to 20 days without unloading its cargo. After that, the presumption is they're selling what's on board. Everything on board has to be taxed. So we know that the ships can be here for up to 20 days without paying a tax. After that, they either have to unload their cargo or they have to be gone. They have to be gone before 20 days are up. So the ships arrive at the end of November. And we know that December 17th is the day the 20-day clock expires. So that's what we're leading to in late November and December of 1773. What will happen with the tea? And that's a story you can best learn by visiting the museum and hearing about the agitation, hearing people participate in the town meetings and be part of this experience. Now, if you go to other institutions, perhaps, or if you hang out on Tremont Street and hear tour groups going by, you'll hear that these were the king's ships. They were not. The ships were all owned by Americans. And you'll hear that they were only carrying tea. The ships had a lot of other things on them. John Rowe, who is a Boston merchant, and in fact, just beyond us a bit is Rowe's Wharf, which is where his wharf was. He was very much interested in the landing of the ships because they were carrying streetlights. Rowe and other Bostonians had pitched in to have streetlights made for the town so that we could navigate the streets after dark. And Phyllis Wheatley, the Boston poet, had gone to London and published her first book of poetry, the first published book by an African-American woman. It's on one of the ships. And a London dressmaker had made a doll wearing a sample dress that he wanted displayed in a Boston window so a nice Boston lady could order a dress from a London manufacturer. I don't think anyone bought the dress, but someone did buy the doll, and that doll is now on display at the Old South Meeting House. So there's really interest in the other things on the ships, but the Bostonians aren't going to allow anything to be unloaded, and the governor won't allow the ships to sail until things are unloaded. So we're really at an impasse until the night of December 16th, when 150 or so men, some from the Eads and Gill printing shop, some from the Green Dragon Tavern, where the Masonic Lodge meets, and some from a carpenter's shop, process through the streets, going past Old South Meeting House, where Bostonians were meeting. There were 5,000 people in the meeting house knowing this is the big day and this is the big event. And this is the largest public space in the town. And the men from the printing shop and the Masonic Lodge and the carpenter shop, disguised loosely with soot on their faces, wearing blankets so no one could recognize them, process past down over Fort Hill to the waterfront to Griffin's Wharf, where they begin destroying the tea. They come aboard the ships. These are men who know how to unload ships. There are probably a lot of longshoremen, dock workers, mariners as part of this group. Some people we know weren't there were Samuel Adams, John Hancock, others of the leaders, because they're still back at Old South making speeches. In fact, the newspapers will cover the speeches they were making while the destruction of the tea is happening right over here. Admiral Montague on a British warship is watching this, and he is surprised by the efficiency and the quiet as these men are proceeding to their work. And they destroy the cargoes of tea and nothing else. One of the captains asked if they could start with another vessel because he has other things on top of the tea. And these men who know their business tell him, don't worry. They very carefully unload the rest of the cargo, place it on the dock, and then go about destroying the tea, hoisting the chests up, cutting them open with axes, pitching the contents overboard. It's actually a very low, the tide is out. And as the tide begins coming in, mounds of tea are rising in the harbor. And men go out in boats to push the tea into the water to destroy it. They want to make it clear, we're destroying this. No one is stealing it. Someone on the dock, crowds have gathered on the docks to watch this. Someone sees a fellow named O'Connor. I don't know if he's someone you're commemorating, but Mr. O'Connor had cut the bottoms of his pockets out, and he is going along the decks of the ship pretending to scoop up handfuls of tea and throw it overboard. He's actually putting them in his pockets, filling up the lining of his coat with tea. Someone spots him, and he tries to get away. They grab the collar of his coat, he wriggles out of it, and then taking an axe, the person who has the coat cuts the lining out, dumps the tea off of the ship. And the next day there's a notice posted in the newspaper. If the gentleman who lost his coat would like to retrieve it, he can find it nailed to the whipping post in Charlestown. I don't know if he ever did. The destruction of the tea is an epic, John Adams says. It really does cast for the other states, other colonies, what has to happen with the tea. Paul Revere is dispatched to New York with news of this, which had been printed up overnight. And he reaches New York about 2 or 3 days later. And another messenger then brings the news to Philadelphia. And on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Philadelphians can read a special Christmas box to the people of Philadelphia, talking about the destruction of the tea in Boston, making it clear this is what will happen to the tea. It just happens the next day, Christmas, the tea ship bound for Philadelphia reaches the Delaware River. Someone goes to Chester to stop it. The captain and the master of the cargo are brought to Philadelphia. And there in front of the State House in Philadelphia, what we now call Independence Hall, there are 5,000 people waiting. And they tell the captain, you have to turn around and go back to England. The tea can't land. And the captain says, I'd really like to, but I don't have enough water or food to get back across the ocean. And remember, the captains, the shippers, are not going to get paid until they've brought the tea here. They've sold it. It's been sold. They go back to England with the receipts. So this guy is out for 2 voyages across the ocean because the company's not going to pay him for bringing the tea back. But he's willing to go back, but he doesn't have enough water or food. The Philadelphians say, we'll take care of that. They supply him with food and water so the ship can return to England. Making a statement, bringing these colonies together in this alliance against the tea and against the company. And here in Boston, the year ends with Thomas Hutchinson pretty much ruined, as Bostonians and the people of Massachusetts are making another choice about how they will be governed. And poor Thomas Hutchinson, it's not just that he made bad choices or he gave a long speech. He is the wicked statesman in the hour of his death. And here you see death about to spear Hutchinson as the devil is holding his list of crimes and the jaws of hell are opening up beneath him. So this is the event that changes the political dynamic in Massachusetts. It didn't create it, but it's an event that people like Samuel Adams and James Otis know how to exploit. When news of this reaches London in the middle of January, it also does not please the Londoners, particularly the members of Parliament who were investors in the company. Parliament strikes back, shutting down the Port of Boston, suspending the government of Massachusetts, ending the town meetings, which had chosen all local officials, and replacing the officials with men chosen by the governor. And this is the step that Massachusetts will not allow to be taken. It's 1774, in the wake of this, that the people of Massachusetts organize to prevent their power to govern themselves from being taken away. Owe it to London not knowing Massachusetts, Massachusetts not knowing what was happening in London, and the long repercussions from the East India Company's conquest of India. It is the moment that begins the revolution. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, again, thank you so much for tonight's presentation. We have plenty of time for questions, and if you do have questions about Robert Allison. We also have close to 200 people watching at home on a live webinar. So our chat box is filled with a few questions as well.
There is one here.
Oh, yeah, please.
What if the boat landed in Philadelphia from UK?
That's a very good question. What if the boat had landed in Philadelphia first? Would they have had something like this happen? Probably not, because actually the first vessel reaches South Carolina first. There is no communication between Charlestown and anywhere else. But what happens there is the local patriots take the tea off and put it in storage. They agree, we're not going to allow this to be sold. They knew we can't allow the tea to be sold. Then we're accepting the governance by the company. So Charlestown, South Carolina, they changed the name to Charleston in the course of the war, puts it in storage. And in 1776, they sell it to try to benefit the local committees of safety. As you know, you keep tea for that long, it's not going to be very good, but they do put it in storage. And in New York, the governor there says, no, we're absolutely going to let the tea land. But he discovers he can't. When that ship, the big storm had blown up, and that's why one of the ships does not reach Boston. The New York ship doesn't get there until later, in April, I think. And at that point, they cannot let the tea land. So had it landed in Philadelphia, they probably would have had the ship turned back, because the Philadelphia merchants are also adamant we can't let the tea land. So it's a very good question. But here, because of the intransigence of Governor Hutchinson, the tea can't be let go. He doesn't think that he can legally allow it to go. And Hutchinson is a great believer in the law. He says, oh yeah, they'll have to go past the warship at Castle Island. It's unlikely the British warship would have fired on these tea vessels. Some of the tea actually, one of the vessels wound up, it gets caught up in the same storm and winds up running aground off of Provincetown, somewhere in the border between Provincetown and Truro on the outer Cape. And guys from Provincetown go out and say, well, we'll take the tea. Guys from Truro say, we'll take the boat. They knew how to divide things up, which landed that way. But meanwhile, one of the Clarks arrives there to get the tea. And he can't find anyone willing to bring this tea to Boston. He does finally hire a guy who says, yeah, I can put it on my boat, take it to Boston. He takes it to Castle Island. He can't get it anywhere else. But then, because this fellow had gone out to the Cape and gotten the tea, I know this isn't answering the question you asked, that captain is from Salem, goes up to Salem, and he knows people are after him. So where will you hide if you don't want a mob after you? He goes into the smallpox hospital. Who's going to go into the smallpox hospital to find this guy? They think he doesn't have smallpox. They go in and bring him out. I think it turns out he did have smallpox. But yeah, so it's real. The tea becomes this extraordinary political symbol. More than a symbol, it's something we have to refuse. So had it happened in Philadelphia first, it probably would have sailed away. And maybe that could have happened here unless Governor Hutchinson didn't allow it to. Do you have a question from someone at home?
Yes, so someone who's named Autonomous Attendee, which is very appropriate for this question, is asking if you could speak a bit more on the participants and their desire to remain anonymous after the event and why they may want to keep that secret.
Governor Hutchinson wants to find these people and arrest them. This is an act, he knows this is a step too far. And incidentally, a lot of people who tended to support the Patriot Clause also thought this was a step too far. George Washington really thought, it pains me to tell people in Massachusetts this, but a lot of people in other parts of the country didn't like us very much. They thought they're a bunch of wacky Puritans. And George Washington thinks that's really a step too far. Benjamin Franklin, who always is several moves ahead of everyone else, writes to Boston and says, now what you should do is pay the company. That way they'll be on your side against Parliament. That is, he knows who the enemies are. You know, it's a little too subtle for anyone else, but they know they'll be arrested. And the thing Governor Hutchinson discovers is no one knows anyone who was there. No one can recognize anyone. Remember, they're wearing disguises. They're even disguising their voices. The next day at this carpenter's shop, one of the apprentices points to the owner of the shop doing this because he has soot behind his ear, which is a sign you were there. But it's only about 15, 20 years later that someone compiles a list of those who were there. And I know the museum is doing a great job now tracking those people down, but they knew they would be arrested. And no one is arrested because no one can identify anyone who was there. It's a remarkable bond of secrecy. That no one reports on anyone else.
Guards, 25 guards, 12-hour shifts. Nobody got killed, they just
No.
kind of walked away.
These, okay, good question about the 25 guards or the 50 guards on each ship. Those are probably the guys doing this. They've been on these ships now for 20 days. They knew the ships. So I think that's really where the list started. And I think where the museum's work started, because the town meeting reports, okay, we appointed these people. Paul Revere was one of them, and other local citizens were part of doing this guard duty. So they weren't there to prevent someone coming aboard and throwing the tea overboard. They were there to prevent anyone coming aboard, unloading the tea and selling it or paying the taxes on it. Thank you for asking. Yep.
Any other questions from the House?
Yes, in the back.
You mentioned Paul Revere. Can you talk about what he did after the Tea Party?
So Paul Revere, that's a very good question. He does a lot of things before, and by the way, Paul Revere did this drawing. He did a lot of engraving. He was a silversmith by trade. Also, he was a messenger. He becomes the leader of the Masonic Lodge after Joseph Warren's death. There's a wonderful book by David Hackett Fisher, Paul Revere's Bride, which is really a compelling story of Boston in this period. And I recommend to any students of history here, the appendices from David Hackett Fisher's book will support a lot of doctoral dissertations and other books, because he's compiled a lot of really interesting pieces of information. And one thing he does, he has a list of the 7 or 8 different organizations in Boston that we know were involved in different aspects of the revolution. The Committees of Safety, the Sons of Liberty, the Loyal Nine, etc. Most people who are mentioned, there are several hundred names on the list, might belong to one of them. And then there's a cohort of maybe 40 or so who are members of 2. And then maybe a dozen who are members of 3. You know, likely you're not going to be a member of a lot. There are only 2 people who are members of 5 organizations. They're Joseph Warren and Paul Revere. And Revere is a tradesman, that is, he works with his hands. He's not a member of the local merchant aristocracy, but he's a hardworking guy who knows a lot of people. And he has becomes really indispensable to this movement. And he does also work at carrying messages. He does not actually own a horse, but he does carry messages. He's the guy who carries the message to New York in this case. At the Commonwealth Museum at the State Archives, they have a wonderful exhibit on the history of Massachusetts. And one of the documents they have on display that's in the State Archives is Paul Revere's invoice for one of his rides, when at the behest of the Boston Committee of Safety, he is carrying a message somewhere else. I don't want to burst any bubbles that he's simply doing this because he loves being helpful. He is getting reimbursed for mileage. And on the reverse of this little invoice, you have the signatures of the Committee of Safety. James Otis, Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren. Professor Fisher and I happened to be looking at that. And he said, look, we didn't even have a government, but we had a bureaucracy. But yeah, so Revere works as a messenger, and then of course he after the revolution, I should tell you there are books written about Paul Revere. I don't need to give you the whole story. Canton has just opened a really nice museum where he built a copper rolling mill in the 1790s to roll the sheets of copper to line the hull of the USS Constitution and the dome of the State House.
Thank you, Bob. Someone named Alan at home was asking if we know if there was a particular individual or group of individuals that might have come up with the idea of dumping the tea in the harbor. Why never the harbor versus, burning the ships or burning the tea, that sort of thing?
That's another very good question, and one that keeps historians busy because we don't know. As I said, the meeting at Old South, they have transcripts of this. Every meeting they have, there are transcripts. No one's keeping minutes at the Masonic Lodge or at Eads, where the Loyal Nine are meeting at Eads and Gill's printing shop about what they're planning to do. At one of these big meetings at Old South, John Rowe, and Rowe is neutral in all of this. He just wants to do business. He says, I wonder how the tea would mix with salt water. And people cheer, thinking he is proposing throwing it into the harbor. Of course, it's the last thing on his mind. He just wants his street lamps to be unloaded. And I think if he owns one of the ships, he doesn't want it damaged, or if it's at his wharf, he doesn't want it damaged. So we don't know who came up with that particular idea. And because they're not keeping records of that. They know what they're doing, what they're plotting is against the law, and it will land them all into serious trouble. I wish we did, and maybe someone will find it. Maybe that'll be the thing that happens with the 250. If someone finds the notebook where they're saying, hey, this is what we should do. That's a good question, and it's a good thing to keep looking. This gentleman had his hand up. That's a very good question. What did the British learn from all of this? From this particular episode, I don't know that they had an immediate response. By the way, in 1774, there's going to be an election for members of parliament. And there is some thinking that if the North Ministry loses, maybe we can get a more conciliatory government in place. Josiah Quincy has gone to London, and he and Benjamin Franklin are meeting with people there to try to get that to happen. It doesn't, of course. And the British do clamp down very seriously on Massachusetts. I mean, this is their real reaction. By June of 1774, Boston Harbor is shut down. And there's a new British fleet in the harbor. Thousands of soldiers have, we really want to teach these people a lesson, which the first British response to this. And if they don't like mild-mannered professorial Thomas Hutchinson, we'll send a new governor, and the new governor is General Thomas Gage, who's the commander of British military forces in North America. The thinking is the mere sight of this force is going to clamp down on any of this trouble. It really doesn't. The trouble moves somewhere else, or they have other ways of undermining British authority. And of course, it all then really comes unglued in April of 1775 when the war breaks out. I think after the war, yes, the British do learn a few things about their empire. We Americans like to think this is the end of the British Empire. It's really in the 19th century that the British Empire is a place where the sun never sets. And Cornwallis, the general who surrenders to Washington at Yorktown, becomes the British viceroy in India. In fact, there's a monument to him in Calcutta. And they learn some things about administering populations that are better to keep the empire peaceful and expanding as a result of this. But here, I don't know if there would have been a way to resolve this. It's a good question. And again, it's another question. You may think, why do we need to keep studying history? It's because we keep thinking about it in new ways and learning new things.
Great. A gentleman named Stephen asks, can you speak a bit more on the role of the Tea Act itself as the reason for the ultimate destruction of the tea?
That's a good question. The Tea Act is putting this, giving a monopoly to the East India Company. And that is the thing you see in these various protests that is really upsetting people. So it's not just that Parliament is continuing to govern us, but now Parliament is turning this over to the company. And it is this monopoly that we now will be subject to rule by the company. as opposed to rule by Parliament. And Parliament, after all, is elected by someone. It's the transformation of a company into a governing entity we can't control is the thing that is really upsetting. Of course, Lord North doesn't really think twice about this because it's a way of bailing out the company, letting them do this. So that really is the T Act. And of course, then T itself becomes the thing to avoid. There's a story, the Governor Gage comes in, suspends the assembly. And in fact, the assembly, they're meeting up in Salem. He sends his secretary to tell the assembly they are suspended. They lock the door. So he actually winds up nailing the closure of the assembly to the door. They're inside choosing delegates to go to a continental Congress. And they want to get the other colonies to side with Massachusetts in this time of distress. And it's unclear if the other colonies will. You think about it. Parliament has shut down Boston. Do New Yorkers want Parliament to shut down New York, or Pennsylvanians to shut down Philadelphia, or Carolinians to shut down Charleston? And it's a big risk that the other colonies will say, you really have pushed it too far this time. That's a story for another day. What happens when the Congress meets in 1774, and actually when Paul Revere brings the word of the Suffolk resolves to the Congress that Suffolk County, the town meeting was suspended, but Suffolk County has a convention that meets in Milton. Joseph Warren presides, and Revere brings their resolves, and the other states say, yeah, we'll go along with that. But before Congress happens, John Adams is practicing law, and he knows he's going to Congress, and it's August of 1774, and he is riding around hearing cases up in Maine, and it's one hot, humid summer day, and all he can think about, when I get to Falmouth or Portland, maybe I can get a cup of tea. He really likes tea. And it would be very refreshing at the end of this long, hot, weary day. He gets into the tavern and he says to the landlady, "Madam, is it possible for a weary traveler to refresh himself with a dish of honestly smuggled, non-taxed tea?" And she glares at him, says, "We don't serve tea here, mister." And she points to her husband and says, "He'll make you coffee." Other questions?
Any other questions?
The gentleman in the back.
Earlier you mentioned Philadelphia initiating some correspondence
Yes.
with some of the other colonies. And we know it's not really until Continental Congress that we really start to come together and realize that we're more connected than we are apart.
Yeah.
Would you mind touching a little bit on the Philadelphia resolutions from October, how that kind of affects?
Yeah. That's a very good question. So you have a plant from the museum who knows much more about the Philadelphia resolutions than I do. But no, actually, that ties in with those committees of correspondence that began connecting the towns of Massachusetts. Samuel Adams follows that by having the Massachusetts Assembly create a committee of correspondence to correspond with the other colonies. So now the colonies are communicating with each other through their assemblies. And the members of these committees generally are people who share Adams's view. But the Philadelphia merchants do come up with this list of their policy. They don't want the tea to land. We can't accept this. And because that will lead to us losing our ability to manage our own affairs. And people in Massachusetts had more ability to manage their affairs than anyone else. And Philadelphia was almost close in that. And they're putting pressure on Boston and other merchants to refuse the tea because, as I said, they all know these Yankees will make a deal with anyone if it will advance their interests, but they're really pressing Massachusetts not to give in to self-interest, but instead stand with everyone else in refusing the tea. So it really is, Philadelphia does play a big role in this, in pressing this Boston initiative not to allow the tea to land. As I said, it's really just chance the first of the ships reached here. It's pretty clear, getting back to the first question, that the Philadelphians probably would not have allowed the tea to land, that they probably would not have had to destroy it. They probably could have let the tea sail back, and then who knows what would have happened in the other colonies. Thank you for the question.
Another anonymous son or daughter in Liberty watching at home would ask, how supportive of the tea destruction was the general public at large at the time?
I'd have to say that the general public was pretty supportive of it here. As I said, there were some who said this is a step too far. Hutchinson by this time had become so isolated that even people who supported him could not be associated with him. You know, he does initially have some success in getting town meetings in some parts of the state not to go along with the idea of a committee of correspondence and this idea that we can't let the judges be paid by someone else. But that really stops after the destruction of the letters. And Hutchinson really is the one associated with all of this in their minds. Hutchinson and the company are really the enemies here. Less so that the king, of course, is not the enemy. We don't like the ministry. And in fact, when the troops arrive in June of 1774, they're referred to as the ministerial army. The troops sent by the ministry, and the reason the ministry is really upset with us is we destroyed the tea that belongs to them. That's really what seems to be driving this. I would have to say the general public seems to be pretty supportive of this, as we can then see the dynamic that unfolds in Massachusetts during the subsequent occupation. And it's really, there are some towns which had not been supportive of this agitation, one being Concord. The town of Concord just wants to trade and thinks that the people in Boston are really deluded. But the thing that gets them is when the governor says you can't have a town meeting. Parliament has shut down your ability to govern yourselves. That turns people who otherwise would have said, yeah, maybe Parliament should govern the empire. Think, well, that means we can't have a town meeting. And that's really the thing. Less so than, hey, we're all happy the tea was destroyed, but now this affects our ability to govern ourselves. There's another story in the 19th century. An historian in one of the towns in Massachusetts hears that there is a guy in the town who on April 19th of 1775 had joined with the local unit and gone down to fight at the Lexington-Concord monotony. So he wants to know why this guy was there. I mean, this is a great opportunity for someone, a young historian, to find from someone who is actually there. So he goes to meet with this old veteran and he says, so what was it that got you to go to Lexington and Concord to answer the alarm? Was it the Stamp Act? I mean, we know what the issues were. And the guy says, I don't think the stamps ever were landed. He says, well, was it the Townsend Act? He said, never heard of them. Was it the Tea Act? He said, I never drank tea. But this is really baffling. These are the things we know got people into the field. He said, well, what was it then? The guy said, we had always governed ourselves. They weren't going to let us do that anymore. We could not allow that to happen.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, I guess one last question here from Stephen watching at home. Besides the East India tea, was there any other tea companies' tea that was normally brought into the American colonies for consumption during that time? Yeah, there was a lot of other tea being brought in, mainly smuggled. You know, the East India Company now gets a monopoly. There are other tea merchants. One grievance the Philadelphians had was they're being put out of business. And if you're someone who doesn't have a license to get the tea, then you can't sell tea. So that is really what's driving this, that suddenly those guys are out of business and you can only get tea through the company. There had been other sources of tea. The unfortunate thing for other tea merchants is this pretty much means no one's going to buy your tea either. And tea itself becomes suspect. There's a crate of tea that someone in Boston gets and they're trying to ship it over to somewhere. Charlestown, which was then a separate town, says, wait a minute, Boston is sending tea through here. Charlestown seizes that crate of tea and burns it on the Charlestown Common. So no one is going to be able to sell tea because all of the tea may be suspect. There's actually, in April of 1774, there's a ship that goes to Annapolis. And the owner of the ship realizes he can't, the tea, it's carrying tea. And he says, well, it's not East India tea. People there say, how do we know that? How do we know you're not in cahoots with the East India Company? And this guy, in order to show his fealty to not importing tea, has to set his own ship on fire.
to prove to people he's not importing East India tea. There's a wonderful painting of this in the Maryland State House, the burning of, is it the Peggy O'Neill, the ship in Annapolis. So tea becomes the symbol, even if it's not East India tea, we're not going to let it be sold.
Well, thank you again so much, Bob. The chat at home